The dust from the stagecoach hadn't even settled when Katherine Victoria saw him standing on the porch of the general store, and her entire world tilted sideways like a wagon with a broken wheel. Kenneth Morrison looked older, harder, with lines carved deep around his eyes that hadn't been there 7 years ago when he rode off to fight for the Union, leaving her with promises whispered under the cottonwood tree, and a ring she had worn until another man claimed her hand. She gripped the wooden railing outside the millinery shop, her black mourning dress suddenly too tight, too hot in the New Mexico sun of 1872, and she wondered if a person could simply stop breathing from the weight of seeing a ghost made flesh. Kenneth's eyes found hers across the dusty main street of Chisum Ranch, and she watched his entire body go rigid like he had been shot. He had been shot, she knew, multiple times according to the letters that had found their way to her through mutual acquaintances, letters that arrived long after she had married Robert Vincent, the banker's son who had courted her when the war stretched from months into years and her father's ranch started failing. Robert, who had promised security and stability. Robert, who had died 6 months ago when his horse threw him during a routine ride to inspect cattle, leaving her a widow at 25 with no children and a ranch that was drowning in debt. She forced herself to look away first, turning back into the millinery shop where Mrs. Henderson was wrapping the black ribbon Katherine couldn't actually afford but needed for the memorial service at the church. Her hands shook as she counted out the coins, aware that Mrs. Henderson was watching her with those sharp eyes that missed nothing in this small town. "That's Kenneth Morrison," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice carrying that particular tone women used when they were pretending not to gossip while absolutely gossiping. "Heard he finally made it back from the war. Took him long enough. 7 years is a considerable time to be gone. The war ended in '65, Katherine said quietly, focusing on buttoning her gloves. "Exactly my point. Makes a body wonder what kept him away all this extra time." Mrs. Henderson handed her the wrapped ribbon. "Of course, you probably remember him better than most, seeing as how you two were practically engaged before he left." Katherine took the package and walked out into the brilliant sunlight without responding, because what could she possibly say that wouldn't feed the gossip mill that had already ground her life into fodder more times than she could count? She had been the girl who waited too long, then the girl who gave up too soon, then the woman who married for practical reasons. And now she was the tragic young widow whose husband's family blamed her for not giving him an heir before he died. The Vincent family had made it clear they wanted the ranch back, wanted her gone, wanted to erase the brief 2 years she had been married to their golden son. Never mind that she had tried to love Robert, had genuinely cared for him even if her heart had never fully belonged to him. Never mind that she had nursed him through fever and kept his house and learned to manage accounts when his drinking got worse after his father's business started failing. Never mind any of it. She walked toward her wagon, head high despite everything, and nearly collided with a solid chest covered in a dusty blue shirt. "Katherine." His voice was rougher than she remembered, scraped raw by time and things she probably didn't want to know about. "I didn't know you were still in Chisum Ranch. Where else would I be?" The words came out sharper than she intended, defense mechanisms she had built over years of disappointment and loss. She stepped back, putting proper distance between them, aware that people were watching from windows and doorways. "Welcome home, Kenneth. I heard about Robert. I'm sorry." He held his hat in his hands, turning it slowly, a gesture she remembered from when he was nervous. "That must have been difficult. People die, especially in places like this." She softened her tone because none of this was his fault, not really. They had been young and in love, and then the war had come like it came for everyone, swallowing up young men and spitting out whoever survived as someone different. "How long have you been back?" "Got in yesterday evening. I've been staying at the boarding house." He glanced around, then back at her, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. "I thought about writing, but I didn't know what to say. After I heard you married, I figured you had moved on. I waited 2 years, Kenneth. 2 years while my father got sicker and the ranch started falling apart and everyone in town looked at me like I was pitiful." She hadn't meant to say it, hadn't meant to let any of that bitterness show, but it spilled out like water from a broken dam. What was I supposed to do? "You were supposed to live your life. I don't blame you, Katherine. I never blamed you." He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "Can we talk somewhere private? Not here with the whole town watching." She should say no. She should climb into her wagon and drive back to the ranch and forget she ever saw him. But she had spent 6 months being proper and correct and following all the rules of mourning, and she was so tired of doing what she was supposed to do. "The old cottonwood tree," she said quietly. "In an hour. I have errands to finish first." She didn't wait for his response, just climbed into her wagon and drove toward the feed store, her heart hammering against her ribs like it was trying to escape her chest. The cottonwood tree was where he had proposed, where he had promised to come back and marry her, where she had believed in forever. The feed store visit took longer than she wanted because Mr. Patterson insisted on discussing her outstanding bill and suggesting, in his awkward way, that perhaps she should consider selling the ranch before the bank foreclosed. She signed a promissory note. She had no idea how she would honor and loaded the supplies herself, because she couldn't afford to pay anyone to help. By the time she drove the wagon out to the edge of town where the old cottonwood grew beside the creek, Kenneth was already there, his horse tied to a low branch. He helped her down from the wagon seat, his hands on her waist careful and brief, and they stood there in the dappled shade like strangers trying to remember how to be familiar. "I should have written more," he said finally. "I should have explained why I couldn't come back right away." "You don't owe me explanations, Kenneth. We were a long time ago." She leaned against the tree trunk, grateful for something solid to support her. "You have every right to build whatever life you want now. I was in a prisoner of war camp for 8 months. Andersonville." He said it flat without emotion, but she heard the weight behind the words. "When I got out, I was in a hospital for another year. After that, I didn't know how to come back here, didn't know how to be the person I was before." Her throat tightened. She had heard stories about Andersonville, whispered horrors that made people go quiet and change the subject. "Kenneth, I'm so sorry. I worked on ranches in Texas for a while, trying to save money, trying to figure out who I was if I wasn't the man who was going to marry Katherine Victoria and run horses on his family's land." He looked at her directly then, and she saw pain there that matched her own. "My parents died while I was gone, fever. The ranch got sold for taxes. Everything I thought I was coming home to was gone. I didn't know about your parents. No one told me." She reached out instinctively, touching his arm. "I would have written if I had known. Would you?" He covered her hand with his. "You were married. You had your own life. I still cared about you. I never stopped caring." The admission felt dangerous, like standing too close to a cliff edge. But caring wasn't enough, was it? Caring doesn't pay bills or save ranches or bring back the dead. They stood there in the fading afternoon light, hands touching, years of words unsaid hanging between them like morning fog. Finally, Katherine pulled away, wrapping her arms around herself. "Robert's family wants to take the ranch. They're claiming that since we had no children, his assets should revert to his father's estate. Never mind that my father gave us the land as a wedding settlement. Never mind that I worked that ranch just as hard as any man." She laughed, but it sounded bitter even to her own ears. "I have about 3 months before the bank forecloses anyway, so maybe it doesn't matter." "How much do you owe?" Kenneth asked, his voice taking on a businesslike tone. "Too much. The herd got sick last year and we lost half the cattle. Robert borrowed money to restock, but then he died before we could sell them off. The banker is his uncle, and he's not inclined to be generous with extensions." She looked at Kenneth, really looked at him, taking in the worn but quality boots, the good leather belt, the horse that was well bred and well maintained. "Why, did you strike gold in Texas?" "I saved every penny I could for 5 years. I lived rough, worked dangerous jobs that paid well, and I didn't spend money on anything except what I needed to survive." He pulled a folded paper from his pocket. "I came back here with enough to buy land and start fresh. I was planning to head further north, maybe into Colorado territory, but then I saw you and I started thinking maybe I was supposed to be here instead." "Kenneth, no. You can't derail your plans because of me. We're not those kids anymore who thought love conquered everything." She pushed away from the tree, pacing along the creek bank. "I made my choices and I have to live with them." "What if I want to make a choice too?" He followed her, catching her elbow gently to stop her restless movement. "What if I want to help you save your ranch? Not because I think you owe me anything or because I expect something in return, but because the idea of you losing everything makes me furious. People will talk. They'll say I'm a scandalous widow taking advantage of my old sweetheart." She met his eyes, seeing determination there that hadn't existed in the young man who left. "They'll say worse things than that. Let them talk. I stopped caring what people thought about me somewhere around the 3rd month of eating worm-infested cornmeal in a prison camp." His jaw tightened. "I'm not saying we have to rush into anything, Katherine. I'm not asking you to marry me tomorrow. I'm just saying let me help. As a friend, as someone who once cared about you, as someone who still does." She wanted to say yes so badly it physically hurt. She also knew that accepting his help would tie them together in ways she wasn't sure she was ready for, emotionally or practically. But pride was a luxury she couldn't afford, not with winter coming and bills piling up, and the very real possibility of losing the only home she had left. "If you help me, it has to be a business arrangement," she said slowly. "A loan with interest that I pay back once the ranch is profitable again." "Fine. We'll draw up papers, make it official." He relaxed slightly, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "Can I see the ranch?" "Assess what needs to be done." They rode out together, her wagon and his horse moving through the familiar landscape of red dirt and scrub brush, with the Pecos River glinting in the distance. The ranch house appeared after a few miles, a sturdy adobe structure that her father had built 20 years ago when he first claimed this land. The barn needed repairs, the corrals needed mending, and the whole place had an air of exhaustion that matched how she felt most days. Kenneth walked the property with the practiced eye of someone who understood ranching, asking questions about water rights and grazing patterns, and the condition of the herd. Katherine found herself talking more than she had in months, explaining Robert's decisions and her own attempts to keep things running after he died, and the challenges of managing hired hands who didn't want to take orders from a woman. "You need more than money," Kenneth said finally, as the sun started dipping toward the horizon. "You need another set of hands, someone the men will respect. Are you offering?" She tried to keep her voice neutral, but hope crept in anyway. "I'm offering to be your ranch foreman. You pay me a fair wage, give me a place to sleep, and I'll help you turn this place around." He leaned against the corral fence, looking out at the scattered cattle. "Purely business, like you said." It was a reasonable offer, more than reasonable actually. She would be a fool to turn it down. She was also terrified of what it would mean to have him here every day, seeing him, working beside him, pretending that her heart didn't still skip when he smiled. There's a small bunkhouse behind the barn. It's not fancy, but it's weatherproof. She made her decision, practical necessity winning over emotional caution. We can settle on wages once I see what I can actually afford to pay. Katherine. He waited until she looked at him. This is going to work out, I promise. She didn't answer because she had learned that promises were fragile things that broke under the weight of real life. But she nodded, accepting his help if not his optimism, and showed him to the bunkhouse where he could store his gear. That night, eating a simple supper of beans and cornbread at her kitchen table, Katherine tried to process the fact that Kenneth Morrison was sleeping 50 yards from her house after 7 years of absence. She had gotten used to being alone after Robert died, had almost preferred it after years of tiptoeing around his moods and managing his drinking. The silence of widowhood had been sad but also somehow peaceful. Now the silence felt full of possibility and danger in equal measure. The next morning, Kenneth was up before dawn, and by the time Katherine emerged from the house, he had already fed the horses and was examining the broken boards in the barn wall. She brought him coffee and biscuits, and they sat on the porch step discussing priorities. The fence line needs to be checked before winter. Can't afford to lose cattle because they wander off. Kenneth bit into a biscuit, making an appreciative sound. You still cook like an angel. Careful, that's not business talk. But she smiled despite herself, pleased that he remembered she used to bake for him when they were courting. Over the next few weeks, they fell into a rhythm that felt both strange and natural. Kenneth worked harder than any man she had ever hired, up early and working until dark, fixing everything that had fallen into disrepair. He hired 2 ranch hands who actually showed up on time and followed instructions. And together, they rounded up the scattered cattle and moved them to better grazing. Katherine kept the books and managed the household, and tried very hard not to notice how good Kenneth looked chopping wood, or how his laugh made something warm unfurl in her chest. They maintained careful distance, professional and polite, never touching beyond what was necessary, never speaking about anything too personal. But then Mrs. Henderson came calling one afternoon, ostensibly to bring Katherine a casserole but actually to interrogate her about Kenneth's presence on the ranch. Katherine served tea in her small parlor and answered questions as vaguely as possible while seething internally at the nosiness. People are talking, dear, Mrs. Henderson said with faux concern. A young widow living alone with a single man, even if he is working as hired help. It doesn't look proper. Mr. Morrison is my ranch foreman. He lives in the bunkhouse, which is a completely separate building. I fail to see how that's improper. Katherine kept her voice level despite her irritation. I'm not judging, dear. I'm just telling you what people are saying. Mrs. Henderson sipped her tea delicately. Of course, if you two were to marry, that would solve everything. Everyone knows you were sweethearts before the war. I've been widowed for 6 months. Remarrying right now would be even more scandalous than hiring a foreman. Katherine set down her cup with more force than necessary. I appreciate your concern, Mrs. Henderson, but I'm perfectly capable of managing my own reputation. After Mrs. Henderson left, Katherine found Kenneth in the barn, brushing down his horse. She must have looked upset because he immediately stopped what he was doing. What happened? He asked, reading her expression. The gossips are having a field day. Apparently, I'm a shameless woman for having you work here. She kicked at a bale of hay in frustration. This town has spent years judging every decision I make. I'm tired of it. We could get married. He said it casually, still holding the brush like he was suggesting they plant corn instead of wheat. What? She stared at him. I said we could get married, solve the gossip problem, combine our resources, make the ranch stronger. He set down the brush, giving her his full attention. It would be practical. You want to marry me for practical reasons. She didn't know whether to laugh or cry. That's possibly the worst proposal I've ever heard, and I once had a man propose because he liked my father's horse breeding program. That's not what I meant. He ran a hand through his hair, looking flustered in a way that was almost endearing. I'm saying it badly. What I mean is, yes, it would solve practical problems. But also, Katherine, I never stopped loving you. Not in 7 years, not through everything that happened. So it wouldn't just be practical for me. It would be everything I wanted since I was 20 years old. Her breath caught in her throat. Kenneth. I know it's too soon after Robert. I know you probably need more time. I'm not trying to rush you or pressure you. He stepped closer, near enough that she could smell leather and hay and something that was distinctly him. I'm just saying that when you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'm here. And I'm not going anywhere this time. She reached up and touched his face, feeling the rough stubble under her palm, the solid reality of him. I cared about Robert, but I never loved him the way I loved you. Does that make me terrible? It makes you honest. He covered her hand with his, turning his head to press a kiss to her palm. You did the best you could with an impossible situation. No one can fault you for that. Everyone faults me for everything. But she moved closer, letting him pull her into an embrace that felt like coming home after a long, exhausting journey. I'm scared, Kenneth. I'm scared of losing the ranch, scared of what people will say, scared of letting myself love you again and having it all fall apart. I'm scared too, but I learned something in the war and after. He rested his chin on top of her head, holding her carefully like she was something precious. I learned that being scared and doing things anyway is the only way to actually live. Otherwise, you're just surviving, and that's no kind of life at all. They stood there in the barn while the horses shuffled in their stalls and afternoon light slanted through the cracks in the walls. And Katherine let herself feel something besides grief and worry for the first time in longer than she could remember. It wasn't quite happiness yet, but it was the possibility of happiness, which was more than she had allowed herself to hope for. That evening they sat on the porch and talked until the stars came out, really talked, about everything they had been through separately and what they wanted for the future. Kenneth told her about the worst parts of the war, the things he had never written in letters, the nightmares he still had sometimes. Katherine told him about her father's death and her difficult marriage and the loneliness of being a woman in a world that didn't value her intelligence or capability. Robert's family is threatening legal action, she admitted. His father hired a lawyer from Santa Fe. They're claiming that since Robert's death was accidental and there were no children, the marriage settlement should be voided. Do they have a case? Kenneth asked, his voice hardening. I don't know. Maybe. The law isn't exactly favorable to women in situations like this. She pulled her shawl tighter against the cool evening air. My own lawyer says it could go either way, and a court battle would cost money I don't have. We need to make this ranch so obviously successful that even if they win their case, you can afford to buy it back or buy different land. Kenneth stood up, pacing the porch in thought. We need to turn a profit this year, significant profit. What about horse breeding? You said your father had a good program. He did, but Robert sold off most of the good stock to pay debts. She felt that familiar frustration rise up. We have maybe 3 horses worth breeding, and we would need a quality stallion which costs money we don't have. There's a man I worked for in Texas, runs one of the biggest horse operations in the state. He owes me a favor. Kenneth stopped pacing, turning to face her with growing excitement. What if I could get him to loan us a stallion for a season? We breed your mares. Keep half the foals, return half to him. It's a risk for him, but I think I could convince him. That would take at least a year to see any profit from foals. But she was starting to catch his enthusiasm despite her natural caution. Which is why we also need to sell off most of the cattle now. While the market is decent, keep just enough for our own use and a small breeding program. Use that money to pay down the bank debt and buy supplies to get through winter. He sat back down beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. It's risky, but playing it safe is going to lose you the ranch anyway. He was right. She knew he was right. The cautious approach hadn't worked for Robert, and it wasn't working for her. Sometimes you had to take calculated risks, bet on yourself and the future instead of clinging to the security of the present. "All right," she said. "We'll do it, your way. Not my way, our way." He took her hand, threading their fingers together. "Partners." "Partners," she agreed, and squeezed his hand. The next month was a whirlwind of activity. Kenneth took their best horses and drove them to market, returning with enough money to make a significant payment to the bank. He also brought back news that his contact in Texas had agreed to the stallion loan, and the horse would arrive before winter. The ranch hands worked dawn to dusk repairing buildings and preparing for the breeding program, and Katherine threw herself into planning and organizing with more energy than she had felt in years. The Vincent family's lawyer sent increasingly threatening letters, but Katherine's lawyer managed to delay any actual court proceedings by citing various technicalities. It was buying time more than winning the fight, but time was what they needed. In the midst of all this chaos, Katherine found herself falling in love with Kenneth all over again, or maybe she had never stopped and was just finally admitting it. She loved how he treated her as an equal, asking her opinion on decisions and actually listening to her answers. She loved how he was patient with the horses and firm but fair with the hired men. She loved the way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she wasn't paying attention, like she was the answer to questions he had stopped asking years ago. 6 weeks after Kenneth arrived back in her life, on an evening when they were sitting on the porch going over account books by lamplight, he set down his pencil and turned to her. "I know it hasn't been very long by conventional standards," he said. "But we're not conventional people, and we've already lost years to circumstance and bad timing. So I'm going to ask you properly this time." He got down on one knee right there on the porch, pulling a small box from his pocket. Inside was a simple gold band with a small diamond, not fancy but beautiful in its simplicity. "Katherine Victoria, I loved you when we were young and stupid, and I love you now when we're older and hopefully wiser. I want to build a life with you, face whatever comes together, and spend every day I have left making sure you know how extraordinary you are." He looked up at her with such open honesty that her eyes filled with tears. "Will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes, absolutely yes." He stood up and kissed her then, really kissed her, and it was nothing like the chaste kisses they had shared as teenagers. This was the kiss of two people who had survived loss and heartbreak and found their way back to each other against all odds. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Katherine was laughing and crying at the same time. "People are going to say I'm scandalous," she said. "Let them. I don't care what anyone says as long as you're happy." He slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly. They decided to get married quickly, without a big fuss, partly to quiet the gossips and partly because neither of them saw the point in waiting. The local minister agreed to perform the ceremony, and they invited only a handful of people. Kenneth's old friend from before the war who worked at the livery stable, Katherine's cousin who lived in Roswell, and a few of the ranch hands who had become loyal friends. Mrs. Henderson found out anyway, of course, and showed up at the church with a cake, declaring that no wedding should happen without proper celebration even if the bride was in half-mourning. Katherine appreciated the gesture more than she expected to, touched that Mrs. Henderson's nosiness came from a place of actual caring. They married on a sunny afternoon in October 1872, with Katherine wearing a simple blue dress instead of a wedding gown and Kenneth in his best suit that he admitted he had bought specifically for this occasion. The ceremony was short and sweet, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Kenneth kissed her with enough enthusiasm that the small gathering erupted in applause and laughter. The reception was held at the ranch, with food spread out on tables in the yard and someone playing fiddle music. It wasn't fancy, but it was genuine, and Katherine realized as she danced with her new husband under the vast New Mexico sky that this was better than any elaborate wedding she could have imagined. This was real and hard-won and precious, because they both knew how easily it could have never happened at all. That night, alone in the house that was now theirs together, Kenneth carried her over the threshold despite her laughing protests that they were too old for such nonsense. He set her down gently in the bedroom, and they helped each other undress with tender patience, learning each other's bodies and scars, physical and otherwise. "I dreamed about this," Kenneth whispered against her skin. "In the worst times, I dreamed about touching you, holding you." "I'm here," she assured him, running her hands over the evidence of his hard life, the bullet scars and other marks. "I'm here and I'm yours." They made love with a combination of tenderness and passion that left them both shaking, and afterward they lay tangled together while Katherine traced patterns on his chest. "You want children?" she asked quietly. It was something they hadn't discussed yet, and she needed to know. "If we're blessed with them, yes. If not, I have you, and that's enough." He kissed her forehead. "What about you? I thought I might with Robert, but it never happened. Maybe it wasn't meant to. Maybe I was waiting for this for us." She propped herself up on one elbow, looking at him seriously. "I'm 25. We probably have time, but not forever. Then we won't waste any more time." He pulled her back down against him, holding her close. "Whatever comes, we'll face it together." The winter that followed was hard but good. The stallion arrived from Texas, a magnificent bay with excellent bloodlines, and they bred him with Katherine's 3 best mares. Kenneth worked on expanding the barn and building better facilities for the horse program while Katherine managed the books and planned for the future. The Vincent family's lawsuit finally made it to court in January, and Katherine and Kenneth traveled to the county seat for the hearing. Robert's father was there with his expensive lawyer, looking smug and confident. Katherine wore her best dress and sat straight-backed beside Kenneth, refusing to be intimidated. The hearing lasted all day, with both sides presenting their arguments. Robert's father claimed that since the marriage had produced no children and Robert's death was accidental, the property settlement should revert to his estate. Katherine's lawyer argued that the land had been given as a wedding gift from Katherine's father, and that her marriage to Robert had been legal and binding, making the land hers regardless of whether there were children. In the end, the judge ruled in Katherine's favor, stating that the marriage settlement was valid and that Mr. Vincent had no legal claim to the property. Katherine nearly collapsed with relief, and Kenneth held her steady as they left the courthouse. "It's over," she breathed. "It's really over." "Not quite," Kenneth said grimly, nodding toward where Mr. Vincent was standing with his lawyer, looking furious. "He's not going to let this go easily." He was right. Over the next few months, Mr. Vincent tried various tactics to cause problems, spreading rumors about Katherine's moral character, trying to convince their hired hands to quit, even attempting to buy up her debts from local merchants to gain leverage. But Kenneth and Katherine presented a united front, refusing to be intimidated or discouraged. By spring, when the first foal was born, a gorgeous filly with her father's conformation and her mother's intelligence, they knew they had made the right gamble. The breeding program was going to work. 2 more foals followed within weeks, both healthy and strong, and word spread quickly about the quality of horses coming out of the Morrison Ranch. Morrison Ranch, Katherine said one evening, testing out the name. I like the sound of that. It's yours as much as mine, Kenneth reminded her. Morrison Victoria Ranch if you prefer, she kissed him soundly. Morrison Ranch, it sounds like a new beginning. And it was. By the end of that first year of marriage, they had turned a modest profit, paid down more of the debt, and established a reputation for quality horses. Kenneth's instincts about the market had been correct, and they had multiple buyers interested in the foals once they were old enough to sell. More importantly, Katherine discovered she was pregnant in the late summer, a development that left both of them stunned and overjoyed. She hadn't been sure it would happen given that it never had with Robert, but Kenneth pointed out that stress and unhappiness could affect such things, and she was certainly happier now than she had been in years. A baby, he kept saying, his hand on her still flat belly. We're going to have a baby. You're not worried, she asked, because she was worried enough for both of them about all the things that could go wrong. I'm terrified, but I'm also more excited than I've ever been about anything. He kissed her gently. You're going to be an amazing mother. The pregnancy progressed smoothly despite Katherine's anxieties. She continued working on the ranch as long as she could, though Kenneth increasingly insisted she let him handle the heavier tasks. They spent long evenings planning the nursery and arguing good-naturedly about names. In March of 1874, their son was born after a long but ultimately uncomplicated labor. Kenneth was there through all of it, holding Katherine's hand and letting her squeeze hard enough to leave bruises, and when the midwife placed the baby in his arms, he cried openly. He's perfect, Kenneth said, staring at the tiny red face. He looks like you. He has your nose, Katherine said, exhausted but happy beyond measure. What should we name him? They had debated many names, but looking at their son, they both knew immediately what fit. Thomas, Kenneth said. After your father. Thomas Morrison. Thomas, Katherine agreed, tears streaming down her face. That's perfect. Becoming parents changed them in ways both expected and surprising. Kenneth was patient and devoted, getting up for night feedings and changing diapers without complaint. Katherine discovered a fierce protective instinct she hadn't known she possessed. They were tired constantly, but also more content than either could remember being. The ranch continued to thrive. Word of their horse breeding program spread, and they had buyers coming from as far as Colorado and Texas. They hired more help, built a second barn, and expanded their grazing land. The debts that had once seemed insurmountable were paid off systematically, and Katherine was able to save money for the first time in years. Mr. Vincent eventually gave up his campaign against them, especially after his own business failed, and he was forced to sell his holdings and move away. Katherine felt sympathy for him despite everything, understanding the grief of losing a child even if she couldn't forgive his cruelty. By the time Thomas was 2 years old, Katherine was pregnant again, and they welcomed a daughter in the spring of 1876. They named her Alina Rose, and she had Kenneth's dark hair and Katherine's green eyes. Thomas was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to help with everything, and Kenneth joked that they were going to have their hands full as the children grew. The years passed in a blur of hard work and genuine happiness. They added more horses to their breeding program, expanding into cattle as well once the horse business was firmly established. Thomas and Alina grew into bright, energetic children who loved the ranch and the animals. Kenneth taught Thomas to ride almost as soon as the boy could walk, and Alina proved to have a natural gift with horses that reminded everyone of her grandfather. In 1878, when Thomas was 4 and Alina was 2, Katherine discovered she was pregnant again. This pregnancy was harder than the previous ones, leaving her tired and occasionally ill, but she was determined to see it through. Kenneth worried constantly, hovering and trying to make her rest more than she wanted to. "I'm fine," she kept insisting. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time." "Those women weren't my wife," he countered, making her sit down when he caught her trying to lift a heavy basket of laundry. Their third child, another son they named James, was born in early 1879 after a difficult labor that scared both of them. But he came out healthy and hollering, and Katherine recovered well with rest and Kenneth's devoted care. "3 children," Katherine said one night, holding baby James while Thomas and Alina slept in their rooms and Kenneth sat beside her. "How did we get so lucky?" "We earned it," Kenneth said firmly. "After everything we went through, we earned this happiness." She leaned against him, bone-tired but completely satisfied. "Do you ever think about how close we came to never having this? If you hadn't come back when you did, if I had lost the ranch, if any number of things had gone differently. I try not to think about it. Makes me appreciate what we have now even more." He put his arm around her, careful not to jostle the sleeping baby. "I spent years believing I had lost you forever. Getting a second chance is more than most people get." As the children grew, the ranch grew with them. They became one of the most successful horse breeding operations in New Mexico Territory, known for quality stock and fair dealing. Kenneth was respected throughout the region as a knowledgeable rancher and honest businessman. Katherine was equally respected, unusual for a woman but earned through her obvious competence, and the success she had built alongside her husband. Thomas showed an early aptitude for business and numbers, spending hours with his mother learning to manage the accounts. Alina had her mother's determination and her father's skill with horses, and she could outride most grown men by the time she was 10. James was quieter than his siblings, bookish and thoughtful, but he had a talent for understanding animals that was almost uncanny. In 1885, when Katherine was 38 and Kenneth was 41, they sat on their porch watching their children play in the yard, the ranch prosperous and peaceful around them. Thomas was 11 and already talking about attending university back east. Alina was 9 and declaring she would never leave the ranch, planning to take over the horse program someday. James was 6 and currently explaining something earnestly to one of the ranch dogs, who was listening with apparent interest. "We did all right," Kenneth said, reaching for Katherine's hand. "Better than all right." She squeezed his fingers, the simple gold wedding band he had given her still shining on her finger after 13 years. "We built something real, something that will last." "I was thinking," Kenneth said carefully, "maybe we should write everything down, our story, how we found each other again, how we built this ranch. For the children, for their children, so they know where they came from." "That's a good idea." Katherine smiled at the thought. "Though I'm not sure I remember all the details anymore. It feels like a lifetime ago. Some things I remember perfectly. The first time I saw you after I came back, you were standing outside the millinery shop wearing black, and you were the most beautiful thing I had ever seen." He brought her hand to his lips. "I remember thinking I had been given a miracle, a chance to fix the biggest mistake of my life, which was leaving you in the first place. You had to go. The war wasn't your choice." She had long ago made peace with those years of separation, understanding that some things were beyond anyone's control. "No, but I could have come back sooner after. could have written more, could have fought harder to keep you instead of assuming you were better off without me." He shook his head. "I wasted years being afraid and broken when I could have been here with you. And I could have waited longer, could have had more faith." She turned to face him fully. "But we can't change the past, Kenneth. All we can do is make the most of what we have now. I know, and I do every single day." He kissed her softly. "I love you, Katherine Morrison, more now than when we were 20, if that's possible." "It's possible," she assured him, "because I love you more now, too." Young love is wonderful, but it's nothing compared to the love you build through years of partnership and struggle and triumph. They sat together as the sun set, painting the New Mexico sky in shades of orange and pink, their children's laughter floating on the evening air. The ranch that Katherine had nearly lost was now a thriving legacy. The love that had seemed doomed by timing and circumstance had survived and deepened into something unshakable. As the years continued to pass, they faced new challenges and celebrated new victories. There were droughts that tested them, market downturns that required careful management, illnesses that scared them, and conflicts that needed resolution. But they faced everything together, the partnership they had forged proving strong enough to weather whatever came. Thomas did go east for university, studying business and agriculture, before returning to help run the ranch with new ideas and modern methods. Eleanor never left, becoming as skilled a horse breeder as her grandfather had been, and eventually marrying a neighboring rancher's son who appreciated her independence and capability. James surprised everyone by becoming a veterinarian, studying in San Francisco, before bringing his expertise back to help not just his family's ranch but all the ranches in the region. Kenneth and Katherine watched their children build their own lives while remaining closely connected to the family business and to each other. They became grandparents, then great-grandparents, the ranch passing through generations but remaining in the family because of the strong foundation they had built. On their 25th wedding anniversary in 1897, their children organized a celebration at the ranch, inviting everyone from miles around. Katherine was 50, her hair threaded with silver but her eyes still as sharp and green as ever. Kenneth was 54, weathered by years of outdoor work but still strong and vital. 25 years, Katherine said as they danced together in the barn that had been decorated for the occasion. "It went so fast. And yet sometimes it feels like I've known you forever," Kenneth replied, holding her close. "Like we were always meant to end up here exactly like this. If someone had told me the day you rode back into town that we would end up here with all of this," she gestured around at the gathered family and friends, the prosperous ranch visible through the barn doors, "I wouldn't have believed them. I was too scared, too beaten down by life." "You were never beaten down, challenged, yes, struggling, absolutely, but you never gave up, Katherine. That's what I loved about you then and love about you now." He spun her gently in time with the music. "You're the strongest person I've ever known." "We're strong together," she corrected. "Separately, who knows where we would have ended up, but together we could handle anything." As the celebration continued around them, Katherine thought about that afternoon 13 years ago when Kenneth had stood in the barn and proposed a marriage of convenience that became so much more. She thought about the girl she had been, waiting for a soldier who might never return, and the woman she became, learning to survive on her own. She thought about second chances and hard-won happiness, and the power of love that refused to die even when everything seemed against it. The ranch that had been her burden became her legacy. The man she thought she had lost became her partner in every sense of the word. The future that had looked so bleak became full of possibility and joy. Years later, when Katherine was 65 and Kenneth was 68, They still lived on the ranch, though day-to-day operations had passed to their children. They spent their time with grandchildren, maintaining the parts of ranch life they still enjoyed, and simply being together after 4 decades of marriage. One evening, sitting on that same porch where they had made so many plans and shared so many dreams, Kenneth took Katherine's weathered hand in his. "If I could go back and change anything," he said, "I wouldn't. Not the war, not the years apart, nothing. Because it all led to this, to you and me sitting here after a life well lived." "Even the hard parts?" Katherine asked, though she thought she knew his answer. "Especially the hard parts. They made us appreciate the good parts more. They made us stronger. They made us us." He smiled at her, the same smile that had made her fall in love with him when they were both so young. "I have no regrets, Katherine, not one." "Neither do I," she said honestly, and it was true. Yes, there had been pain and loss and struggle. Yes, she had married another man and spent years wondering what might have been. Yes, Kenneth had suffered things no person should have to endure, and they had both carried scars from their separate journeys. But those journeys had brought them back to each other, older and wiser and capable of building something that lasted. They had taken broken pieces and created something whole and beautiful. They had turned loss into legacy and second chances into a love story for the ages. As the sun set over the New Mexico landscape they both loved, painting the sky in brilliant colors, Katherine leaned against her husband's shoulder and felt completely at peace. She had been the sweetheart he left for war, then a woman who married another, then a widow who nearly lost everything. And he had been a soldier, a prisoner, a drifter, and finally a man who came home. Together, they became something neither could have achieved alone. Partners, lovers, parents, grandparents, and the foundation of a family legacy that would endure for generations. They became proof that love could survive anything if two people were willing to fight for it, to choose each other again and again, to build something meaningful from the ashes of what might have been. The Morrison Ranch stood as testament to their determination and love, acres of land teeming with horses and cattle and life. But the real legacy was in the family they created, the children and grandchildren who learned from their example that strength came in many forms, and that love worth having was love worth fighting for. Kenneth Morrison had come home from war 7 years too late to prevent Katherine Victoria from becoming someone else's wife. But he had come home exactly when she needed him most, when she was a widow facing impossible odds and about to lose everything her father had built. Their timing had been terrible and perfect in equal measure, bringing them together when they were old enough to appreciate what they had, wise enough to fight for it, and strong enough to build it into something that lasted. Years after Katherine and Kenneth had both passed peacefully in their sleep within months of each other, their great-grandchildren would still tell the story of how great-grandma Katherine had nearly lost her ranch, and how great-grandpa Kenneth had come home from war just in time to help her save it. They would talk about the love story that had survived separation and loss and doubt, about the partnership that built a legacy, about choosing each other against all odds. And in the telling, the story would grow larger than life, becoming legend in the family. But the truth at its core remained simple and profound. Two people who loved each other found their way back together and built a life so rich and full that it blessed everyone who came after them. They proved that second chances were real, that love could survive anything, and that the best stories didn't end with "they lived happily ever after," but rather they fought for their happiness and won together. The Morrison Ranch still stood generations later, still breeding fine horses, still managed by descendants who carried Katherine's determination and Kenneth's practical wisdom in their blood. And on quiet evenings when the New Mexico sun painted the sky in impossible colors, if you listened carefully, you could almost hear the echo of laughter from the porch, the sound of two people who had found their way home to each other and never let go again.